Hi everybody who's watching online, welcome to this live stream of this talk we're giving in Donegal Railway Heritage Centre. The talk will be starting shortly, so just hang on, grab yourself a cuppa and we'll get going shortly. Hi everybody, welcome back and welcome to everyone here in the room. We're about to start our talk on Donegal Railways. First manager here, Marty, is going to give a little introduction. I'm going to get out of the way now and then we'll hand over to Joe.
Hey everybody, so thank you very much for coming today for the first event of our extensive Heritage Week 2025 programme. You'll see some of the other events that we will have on later in the week. You'll have seen the wee programmes around there. I'm Marty Gilroy, I'm the new-ish manager here at the museum and we're really delighted to welcome you. Just some general points, exits obviously to the back and front, and if we could hold the questions, if you have any, until the end, and if we have time we'll be able to take a few of those. Some of the members of the museum here were present at our AGM this afternoon, where I discussed the new strategic plan we're putting together to guide our development over the coming years. One of our action points in that plan is to emphasise an approach that views railways as a window into history, society, culture, a sense of place and our local communities. In a way, this event was planned as a way of showing just how interesting and attractive that view can be, as we know that the work of Dr. Joe Kelly equally leans towards a view that roots our railways in local social history and the stories of the communities that it once served. Some of you will be familiar with Joe from his regular Talking History spot on Greg Hughes' 9 till noon show on Highland Radio. Others from the many lectures he's given on a variety of aspects of the county's history. For the unfamiliar, we envy your first experience of one of Joe's excellent, informative and entertaining talks. We're very excited to welcome him to the coach today and we greatly appreciate his time and his efforts. So please welcome Dr. Joe Kelly.
There you go.
Okay, Guramaigad Marty, and good luck with all that you've planned. There's a wonderful catalogue of what you're planning to do. That's brilliant. And welcome everybody here. I'm a little bit nervous because this space is just quite. You think you're moving because you're sitting in a carriage, and I think it's a first for me to give a talk in a carriage, and in a confined space like this. But look, thank you for coming. And I'm not by any means an expert, and I just have a general interest in history. I have to say before I start, I've always been very, very happy to come to just here, because the John Bosco Centre was where the count was always held for the Udras elections, and my father spent 20 years elected every time, and we'd come here, and he was always elected for 20 years, and when the count was there he never lost an election. So I've always have warm memories of the John Bosco Centre, so just have to say that. But thank you for the invitation, and look, we'll talk about the railways in Donegal and maybe how it came to happen, and I'm sure there are people here far more knowledgeable and far more expertise, have more expertise maybe in certain areas than I would have here. So this is just a general history of what happened in Donegal Railway, put it into modern perspective starting out, and then maybe working into the folklore and the stories at the end. So you see now, are we moving?
Hang on, that's my fault, sorry. Wait a second. Right, should be good to go.
All right, so here we go. That's just a map, spot the difference between the rail network that we had in the 1920s and today. And I think it's very, very clear what you see is not here compared to where we were in the 1920s, just before we got independence. And that's what the railway network eventually became in Donegal at its height. So you can see that it went right the whole way to Glenties, right the whole way to Burtonport. So that's been lost, and obviously a little bit here as well, joining up across from, you can see from Pluck right across to Strabane. So just interesting, the island of Ireland has at present 1,438 miles of rail, public rail. That's between the Translink in the 6 counties and the Iarn in the 26 counties. So together they have 1,400 almost miles of rail. And I've been on Highland Radio talking about this, and it was a strategic plan launched there just last year, 2024, an All-Ireland strategic plan. And what they planned, that's what they said the baseline report was. That's what it's like now at the moment. That's the rail infrastructure in the whole island of Ireland as we speak. And I think it's a map that says it all. And there's the proposal that they were going to, the potential future of railways and how they were going to invest. And Donegal was just to get this little bit here. That's all we were going to get. You can see it here in the map. That was in the proposal that was made for the government. And so there was to be 37 billion spent. That's including inflation. That's 37,000 million nationally. And Donegal was to get maybe between 200 and 300 million of 37,000 million, which works out at less than 1.23% of the overall national budget. So that's just to put the rail in perspective, where we were and where we're proposing to go. So that's just very interesting, and for that I often say, and you'll hear me in Highland saying, is Donegal really done? Is it the done that's in Donegal? Are we the phantom, part of Ireland? Are we politically decapitated? There's only 6 miles of Donegal that touches the Free State. That's a very important thing to say, and I don't want to be political, but we do not have an MEP now along the border counties for the first time since the beginning of the European elections. Again, the politicians have moved towards the population centres. So look, that's just a political reality, and that comes to impact our rails and our infrastructure. So let's go and look at where the railway really started. The railway mania started just before the Irish famine, but in England in the 1840s. And that was a map of the rails in England. Movement for industry primarily. And by 1911, look at what you have. the whole place in England. They evicted people, they made the train tracks, they just got ahead and made the rail infrastructure, which is still there today. And you can see the difference in the map. So that mania also kind of spread to Ireland. And so in 1834 we had 6 miles of rail. And by 1912 it was 3,403 miles of rail paid for by the British government in Ireland. Now, considering for the whole island of Ireland today, this is where we're at. And that's what we had. It's a far cry from where we used to be. So let's look at now, maybe looking at the Donegal Railway and how did it come about, what was happening at government level, what was happening at local level. Initially it was proposed that they were actually going to create a canal across here because of opening up the idea of Donegal and that whole area. And it was proposed in the House of Commons in 63 and in 65 that they would cut a trench across here, a canal, create a canal, and it would cost about 38,000. And Sir John Rennie was the person that was trying to promote this and develop this. And there were 7 Londonderry financiers, as it was called then, willing to pay for this. And this would bring trade and industry, etc. And so that was the plan, but it never happened. Never happened. Imagine trying to build now that canal, how much it would cost. It was 38,000 back then. So what happened then in 1848, the Londonderry and Enniskillen Railway opened its first line along the Foyle River as far as Strabane. So that was the beginning of the rails in this area. And then in 53, Londonderry Coleraine Railway, as it was called. And then in 45, the 2 railways were proposed for Donegal. So we were catching up. So this is where it started. And then what about Donegal? So just before the famine, they were proposing that there would be rail in Donegal, like anywhere else on what was called then the British Isles. That Donegal was to get their share as well. So the great county Donegal Railway was founded, and we see here in the Londonderry Journal on 23rd of September 1845 that there was a notice from promoters of the Great Donegal Railway, Ballyshannon-Ramelton via Donegal Town, Letterkenny, with branches to Lifford and Derry, and the whole idea was to ship things from Ramelton using Liverpool and Glasgow to make that connection. And the promoters estimated it would cost about £600,000 back then. This was 1845. And people like Lord George Hill, who was in Gweedore and also in Ramelton, that's where he lived. James Stewart, Edmund Hayes, he would be in Stranorlar, and then Alexander Stewart and Ards and Dunfanny. They were the main promoters of this railway suggestion that this is what they would do. And then the Great Northern Western Junction was proposed, and there's a more impressive plan coming from England. And the plan was a trunk line was proposed from Enniskillen and Sligo Railway across to Donegal into Derry and to branch off Letterkenny, Ramelton, Rathmullen. That was the proposal, and it would cost about 1.5 million. But both these schemes came to nothing. These were just proposals that what they were intending to do and how they would see rail developing in Donegal. So the first really rail that came across was the Lough Foyle and Lough Swilly Railway Company, renamed Londonderry and Lough Swilly Railway later on, but they made a track to Farland Point. So from here, Derry, down to Farland Point. It was a short rail track in 1864, but it closed very soon. It wasn't open very long. And then they decided, well, we'll carry on to Buncrana, which was a 5'3" gauge, and it opened, no big question about it, no big noise, in 1864. Now, Buncrana was a very, very important town. Still is, but very, very important. Various different kings, Edward, I think Victoria, I think 3 kings or queens of England came to Buncrana. Being so close to Derry. And I think Buncrana itself as a town has suffered immensely because of the partition. But it was an amazing town even back at this time, and having the rail in there was essential for tourism and trade. So then the idea of moving it in towards this direction of the county was Strabane First Railway was 1847, but a group of landlords said, look, we need to move this westward into Stranorlar. And the project was called the Finn Valley Rail. And Lord Lifford and Samuel Hayes, they were the 2 of the largest landholders in this area, in East Donegal. They promoted it. Again, it was a 5'3" gauge, and it was to start in 1861, 5,300 per mile, and they estimated it would cost about 70,000. That's what they were. And that opened in 1863. So here you have the building here, Stranorlar Railway Station. Beautiful building. Just the way it was designed, like even just the architecture alone is amazing. So then the Letterkenny Railway, this was a real difficult one. This went on and on and on. And it was proposed in 1855. There was a meeting held at Letterkenny to arouse interest in the company called the Londonderry and Letterkenny Railway. Committee was formed, but nothing happened. I think that house is still there in Letterkenny. If you're where the former, yeah, yes, it's, you wouldn't see it like that. But so then the Letterkenny Railway continued. 1858, the public will be gratified. This was in the Londonderry Standard, that the preliminary steps have been taken for an application to Parliament for a bill authorising the construction of a proposed railway. So again, somebody else had come along to try to promote it. This was John Fraser, county engineer, and that he'd done the survey of the grounds, and in his report it was considered, this is favourable, this is something we can do, and here's how we're going to do it. But the project always met obstacles. So in 1858 we see another report in the Derry Journal. The project railway extension Derry by the way of Luswilly has been abandoned. Yeah. So it'd start and it would stop. A growing opinion prevails that a junction with Enniskillen Railway and St Johnstone would be preferable to the route proposed in the bill in question. And all these times the bills had to go through government because government money was going into it. So it wasn't just as straightforward as just wanting to go and build a railway. There was a lot of politics involved in it. So then again it was mooted again in 1860, and the idea that it would cost 100,000 plus 33,000 of loans. And in this plan it was given royal assent. Yes, okay, you can go ahead and have your railway. That's the capital that's required. That's the amount of loans that you're allowed to, because they were very strict with the amount of loans you could use in case the railway company wouldn't be viable. And the government didn't want to be left with the debt, so they set certain criteria, and there had to be a bridge over the Swilly, and it had to be lit up at night for safety. So if the train was going to cross, just people walking. So that was, and for boats, obviously the vessels as well. But again, this was delayed, and eventually in 1864, A.J. Stewart turned the first sod for this new railway in the Port Bridge. But again, it stopped again. So you've 2 years. It stopped in 1866. That it's a certain amount of the work, and then it stopped. Finance was the problem again, and trying to get it estimated. So the people that were promoting it now were allowed to borrow 100,000, but they could only have 23,000 of that was borrowing that the government would be accountable for. And so this had to again go through government. You can see the Act 1874, whereas Letterkenny Railway Company, who is herein as referred to as a company, were incorporated by an act passed in 1860. So things have moved on for the making of a railway. So they had to have legal sanction to continue doing what they were proposing to do from day one. So it was pretty complicated with regards to legality. Another act was required, and look, you can see it again and again and again and again, and it was delay after delay after delay, obstacle after obstacle after obstacle. And eventually they decided, look, it was lying derelict for 10 years, a certain amount of work had been done and it hadn't achieved anything. So they decided the way around this was to make a smaller gauge. It's cheaper, and it would be reduced to a 3-foot gauge, which would lead to difficulties further down the line. So in 1880, it was in June 1880, an act was passed again allowing them to proceed and to borrow the money and to get government funding. And so in 1883, June 30th of June, it was opened. But it was not interchangeable, and passengers and freight had to transfer a tow ban for every journey because it was a 5-foot 3 gauge on the other side. But at least they had the infrastructure in place, and the train was up and running. So that was 1883, and this is one of the advertisements that were in the papers for cost. So how much it would cost you return, or how much it would cost for if you were going to Derry or whatever. So on Saturday the 30th of June, and until further notice, trains will run daily, okay, except Sundays. Leave Letterkenny at 8 o'clock and arrive at 9:50. So an hour and 50 minutes. And leave Derry at 4:15 and arrive at 6:05. So fairly slow. There's no wild speed in it, but look, it was movement. So now Letterkenny had been connected, Stranorlar had been connected. So what about the west, where I come from? And if anybody ever gets the chance, this is a book of a collection from the country of the congested district boards. This was set up by the British government. It was a wee bit like Udras na Gaeltacht, that's for the Gaeltacht, or it's a wee bit like the Western Development Commission that's set up by the government that exists at the moment, trying to promote industry in the western counties of Ireland. This, and Eamon O'Keefe, when he was Minister for the Gaeltacht, set up this programme called CLAR, C-L-A-F-A-D-R, Cantraha Lag Ard Reactanis, weak areas of high need. And they realised along the west coast of Ireland that there was a lot of difficulty. So they set up this thing called the Western, not the Western Development Commission, the Congested District Board, to look into see how they could economically develop the west of Ireland. And they put millions and millions and millions into building piers, bridges, curing stations for fish, carpet factories, different industries, buying boats for fishermen, teaching them how to create nets, investing into coopers to salt the fish and put them into the wooden tanks for exporting. Crocheting. They even actually paid for stallions to be brought in to each of the RIC stations so that they would breed with the local horses to increase the standard of breeding. And sometimes they brought in rams as well. And you would go to the RIC station, get a loan of it for the night or whatever, and bring him back, whatever. This was so it's a beautiful history to that Congested District Board. And if you look around the county, so many buildings still exist, done by the Congested District Board. But one of the things that they had realised that West Donegal was really hadn't recovered from the famine at all. It was still highly densely populated, people were still very poor, and there was no movement out of it. And so the fishing ports were operating as at a grave disadvantage compared to English and Scottish counterparts, because they were able to get the fish to London fairly quickly or to the markets. As where in Donegal they couldn't. We were so isolated. And the whole idea of the government's philosophy, which led to the famine in one way, is that it's called laissez-faire, laissez-aller. It's a French phrase. And the idea was, don't interfere with the economy. Let things happen the way they happen. Because once you step in, you make an unbalance of it. So for example, when it came to the railways, well, we're not going to invest in railways. If it's viable, it's viable. And if it's not viable, we're not going to actually put money into it to make it viable. That would have been the philosophy that they would have had. It was a French philosophy originally. And there's still people that have that philosophy that, you know, let things develop naturally. And let the market decide. But we don't think like that in our country, certainly not. And so what happened was the government had a change of heart over time and said, look, we have to help these people. We have to put in the infrastructure for them in order for them to make a living and to survive where they're living. And one of those things is they need the railway. So the Alport Commission was set up in 1886 to look into, particularly West Donegal, what could they do to help rural Ireland and the poverty, the ongoing poverty that was there, and particularly deep sea fisheries and the railways. How could that benefit the fisheries, also for communication, and then how they would organise and manage the existing railways. So this was the three things he was told to investigate. And from his report he came back and said, look, at the state guarantees rather than the barony through which the lines will pass. You see, up to now, if the train track was built and it didn't work out, then the people locally and the landlords locally would be encumbered with that debt. The government now were proposing, saying, okay, we'll take on the debt. So if it doesn't work, we'll take it on. It'll not be paid out by the local people. Local contributions should be limited, ability to undertake such funding, so that we don't need as much local contribution, that the government must come in and support this, and that there be strict government scrutiny and also government engineers over the whole project. And that's basically what happened then for us. The railway was expanded into the west of Donegal, and he said that it should be built from Letterkenny to Falcara into the northwest of Donegal to Kilmacrennan, Creesla, Dunfanny. That was his proposal. And Balfour came along, and we could talk about him for quite a while, but in the 1880s, late 1880s and 90s, he'd been to Cloughaneely and Gweedore investigating the rail. But at that time, the second biggest eviction campaign in Ireland took place. My own great-grandfather, my father's grandfather, he was evicted 4th of April 1889. And Wyburn Alford, who was a local landlord, evicted 450 families. Every family in Falcara and in Godahork were evicted. So there was a lot of tension. Father McFadden, the parish priest in Gweedore, was jailed 2 occasions. Father Stephen the curate in Falcarra, who was from Ballyshannon, was jailed on 2 occasions. They stood with the people. Another day, another story. But there was a lot of tension going on there. And in the midst of this, he had come he actually stayed in the Courts Hotel in Gweedore, and he was the Chief Secretary of Ireland, and he was looking into, look, we have poverty here, particularly in Donegal. What are we going to do about it? And so he said, right, we're going to fund a railway. And in 1890, he says, look, no matter what, we're going to put a railway into northwest Donegal, and the state will get finance, and we'll give grants, and we'll try to get this done. So the great thing was, he was saying to the local landlords and all, if you borrow money, whatever, it'll only cost you 3%, which was low interest at that time. We won't charge you high interest, and the state as a partner will share the profits if there are profits. So it's a kind of a public-private partnership. And they ask anybody interested, please apply. The closing date is the 1st of January 1890, and to see what people might be interested in, where they would like the railway to be built into the west of Donegal. And there were various different proposals, not just in the west of Donegal, but other landlords and gentry people in Donegal and throughout the country said, well, we'll cash on this as well. If it's available to them, it's available to us. So there was a proposal for a rail to go from Buncrana to Carandona. There was another one from Glenties to Killybegs, and then the Letterkenny Gweedore one that I'm talking about, the big one. And it was all, proposals were made and plans were made, and how many miles for each, and how it was going to develop and what route it would take. This was all being proposed. Again, another one, Earl of Leitrim, Lord Leitrim, down through Remelton, Milford, Creaslid, Dunfanaghy. Well, it was his person that came after Lord Leitrim, sorry, the Earl of Leitrim. And then there was one proposed for Sternora to Glenties, Sternora to Fintown, Fintown to Glenties, and then from Fintown to Bunbeg, going back into Gweedore to go that way, as opposed to go around the west coast. There was one for Sternora and Glenties. These are all proposals that were put into Balfour, Donegal Town to Killybegs, Glenties to Fintown. So you can see there's quite a lot there. And the cost of all these proposals of 200 miles of rail in Donegal alone, and it was about 5,500 per mile. He estimated that it would be about 1,100,000 to develop all these proposals, that the 8 different proposals here for the railway in Donegal, to advance what was done there. And what I estimated, I just went into the inflation calculator, that 600,000 back then was about 98 million. So he was proposing 98, Balfour was proposing an investment of 98 million, but that was for the whole country. And all these proposals weren't going to be weren't going to meet the criteria. So the railway development in the east and the south of the country had many advantages over the northwest, apart from the geographical, much flatter and less difficult. And it also had more landed gentry that could fund this. The Board of Works instituted a commission of inquiry, and they sent them into the regions to find out, like, how can we develop the railway. And the president, Hutchinson, and different others sat at various centres throughout the county in January 1890. And they travelled around. They went to Carandona, Derry, Letterkenny, Dunfanaghy, Bunbeg, Killybegs, Sternora, Donegal Town, Glenties. They moved around, and they heard from between 100 and 200 people, taking notes, listening, how their area would benefit from rail and why should they develop rail into their area. And so they had a kind of a commission of understanding, or listening to what the needs were and what was the best possible avenue to develop the rails in Donegal with the limited money they were going to get. And so it was decided then that they would develop and expand from Sternora to Donegal Town. That was one way they were going to go. And the second one was the West Donegal Railway was going to be formed as well, that was going to happen as well. And so work began on the 1st of August 1880 and finished in the September 1889, 9 years. And so they had the railway going from Sternora to Donegal Town, the Finn Valley Railway was it called, and the West Donegal Railway. They merged together in 1892, and they called them just the Donegal Railway Company. And the regauging from Strabane to Sternora, the 5'3" to the narrow gauge, so that they would all be compatible. It was cheaper to build. And so they operate from Strabane through to Donegal Town. So that was all opened up. And so you can see that things had really developed at that stage, and you can see the barns and the train track there and all that had happened. So there was little controversy regarding the railway's proposals for lines to Killybegs, Carandona and Glenties. The question of whether Sternora to Glenties railway should be narrow gauge or standard gauge was the question. Back in the west, Leitrim and Alford, in my own hometown, were fighting as to how the rail would go. Leitrim wanted it into Milford, my landlord said, well, we don't need to go to Melford, we need to go into Falcara and Falcara to Gweedore and try to get to Burtonport. So both had alliances. There was substantially a Protestant alliance, and it was heavily based landed gentry that had money and influence in the area. So both kind of had a camp beach. But this is why Bernalford's here. It was in Ballyconnell. And eventually he actually was able to use the Catholic clergy, even though two of them had been jailed. They were supporting him on the other side to get a railway into the Gweedore and Cloughaneely. So the two of the priests that were actually jailed in part by him and by the eviction campaign, here they were hoping to campaign for railways into their parishes. Both sides used the church, as I said, and Alford and Charles Stewart in Dunfanaghy and Robert Worthington at Dublin proposing to build 114 miles of railway at about 500,000, half a million, and would employ about 1,000 men, and they would get a pay of 2 shillings per week. You know, so that was over the local rate. So it was a good pay. Father McFadden, as I said, in Gweedore, Father McFadden in Cloughaneely, he was a different Father McFadden, were really supporting all this, as were other priests as well. And Father McFadden in Glenay said that the shirt factories in Derry were willing to establish a shirt depot in Cloughaneely if this railway would open up. Because at that time people were growing flax, and flax made the linen and the scutcheon and all that went on. So he was saying, look, this would be good for the local community as well. And here's Father McFadden, who was jailed, as I said, and he wrote a book. I actually have the original copy of this, The Past and Present of Agrarian Struggle in Gweedore. This is about the evictions, but at the bottom he writes, and letters on the railway extension in Donegal. So he was really, really proactive, realising the value of the railway into Donegal, and a very influential man. So the commissioners went back to Donegal in 1891 to investigate, and they favoured an inland route, which eventually was a route from Letterkenny into Creesla, and then from Creesla in the back of Muckish, that direction. So the deputation arrived to Letterkenny and Gweedore Railway, consisting of Boyd and John Alford and different other people, and also so they were introduced to Lord Balfour in London in 1891, and they were proposing the inland version. And in 1892, Alford and his fellow promoters announced the dissolution of the Letterkenny Gweedore Railway. It was going on, and they were getting nowhere. They were getting, just felt that they were getting nowhere, and said, look, to hell with this. But that all was not lost, because another brother of Balfour's, was called Gerald Balfour. He was the younger brother of Arthur, who was the Chief Secretary of Ireland, and Horace Plunkett. He was on the Congested District Board that I mentioned earlier on. Then the government introduced the Light Railways Act in 1896, which guaranteed that more monies would be made available for building rails. So all this work that had been done previously into the west of Donegal would come to something good now. The Board of Works was given power to appoint some fit person to inquire into the conditions, working, maintenance of the railway constructed under this act. So the government would take charge of that. McFarlane then employed a civil engineer, Edward Radcliffe, from the neighbouring county of Donegal Railways, to draw up new plans for the railway from Letterkenny to Burtonport. And the reason they wanted to get to Burtonport was the fishing, so that the fish could be landed in London within 24 hours. That's amazing that they could get a fish landed in Burtonport and to London in 24 hours. That was the plan. Get it to Dublin, Holyhead, train track down to London, and there be on the markets. And that was the plan. So this was almost a copy of what Alford had proposed back in 1890, and the basis of it. So this was the route that they were, and that's the route that it became. So the Congested District Board had identified Burtonport as a location which could be profitably making use of it for fishing. And in 1896, the heads of agreement were made for this, and so the construction started. It was to be 49 miles from Letterkenny to Burtonport, and it was calculated at 316,181. Yeah. So, And they'd even down to they had it down to
3 pence.
down to even the penny. It was, just shows you how LSD. Yeah. So the construction began about 10 feet above sea level and finished at Burtonport at the same sea level. So there were 24 gatehouses and 13 stations. Some of them are still there along the route. and that's just one of the stations, Cashnagore. It's still there. It's been refurbished. I'm sure you've other ones as well. That's the Gweedore station. Took them to the train station Gweedore. Men got half a crown per day. That's what they were getting, and they worked 10 hours a day. That's Errigal here in the background. And so that's it. And the carriages like what we're in here now ourselves. 19th of December 92, 2 carriages ran through to test this line. And there was a whole report in the Derry People, a very interesting, made the opening of the prayer, the opening of this area, progress, prosperity for the district through which it runs. Anyway, look, there's numerous reports. So it was opened then in Saturday, 28th of February 1903, and it was called the Letterkenny Burtonport Extension Railway. And it was 49 miles, 0.5 miles, handed over to Loswilly. That's it here, Loswilly Company, Rail Company, and they basically ran it. The impact of that was very positive. As I say to you about the fishing, the Lawton fish buyer and merchant was able to get fish across, and wages and incidental expenses amounted to over £27,000. And that was massive money back then, because the railway now could take the fish out of the community. And so the Congested District Board then were able to invest money into building the cooperage, the tubs for putting the fish into, a salting, curing centre. So all this money and ancillary money came in as well, which developed the fishing industry. So the same in Downings and in Torry. They had a curing station in Torry. They had one, a little small one in Maharorty on the pier there. But the Congested District Board realised that the rail could open up this whole thing for them. So by 1906, the cooperage was capable of producing 7,000 barrels annually. But the fish market in Burtonport alone demanded about 18,000 per annum barrels of fish. This is the industry that was being opened up to the west of Donegal. Now here are the problems. It was they give out about the erratic and undependable timetable. It was sometimes it was too slow. The average speed was 25 miles an hour. There was lots and lots of difficulties. And for example, for a report on the 28th of January 1904 at 6:30, the train was speed at 20 miles over the Owen Carrow viaduct, and the train. So it was considered to be very, very slow at times. Here's just the idea of lateness. So they had everything down. So for example, over 30 minutes late 25 times in a 6-week period, over 1 hour late 11 times. So they weren't happy with the punctuality of the rail. And how it could be very, very late and slow. Over 6 hours, one. Over 8 hours, one. And over 13 hours, one. 13 hours waiting for your train. So, yeah, that was 1904. So anyway, I don't know if you know much about the Creasla Viaduct disaster, but it was just one of the disasters that we had. They're amazing. They're still there. You'd know passing on to them all the time. And some of them are really, really high, and they're still there. The Owen Carrow. So what happened was the train was coming from Letterkenny and it blew off the track. That's what happened. It was the 31st of January 1925. They had a commemoration there recently, and it left Letterkenny about 7:05. And it was a strong gale, and the roof was ripped off. Well, it was hit by the wind, and the carriage blew off. And the nearest to the rails, the engine of the rails, they fell over the edge. We'll see a picture of it in a minute. The roof was ripped off, and 4 passengers dropped 40 feet to their death. It was horrific enough. But one of them, actually, I would know one of the relations from Falcarrow and Mulligan. So this is what happened here. And obviously they're trying to get up to it. This was why they showed this up here. So that was the Owen Carrow disaster, and there's a monument and everything there. And some people were done and tried to save them and rescue the people that were on the track. But the train continued until 1940, certainly in northwest Donegal, and it was removed eventually. I think Canon Doherty, if anybody ever remembered Canon Tommy Doherty, filling the 4-penny seats, he has the last train run. He was with the cine camera taking a video of it. Beautiful. And so 1948, Gweedore, Letterkenny, turf in the wartime, they needed it. I don't know if you've ever seen in Phoenix Park, there's little hills in Phoenix Park. Have you ever seen them? It was turf that De Valera had sent to the city, knowing that there'd be a coal crisis because of no imports. So what he had seen to was that turf was taken from the west up into Phoenix Park, and they had these mountains of turf. If you actually Google it, and you'll see some fab people cycling by, and you'll see just the turf. And obviously the turf was left there over years, and the grass grew over it. And that explains why you have these hills in Phoenix Park. It makes no sense. And by the way, just on what I'm saying, Phoenix Park, the Irish place names are terribly important, but it's Fíor Uisce, true water. But the English translated that as, it sounds like Phoenix. It's nothing to do with the Phoenix. It's Fíor Uisce, true water. The true water. And like I ask the children I'm teaching, what's the Irish for Dublin? And they'll say Ballaclia. No, it's not. It's Duflin. Blackpool, Duflin. You know, it's anyway, same with other place names. But anyway, that was it. The train, by 53, the train services were ended and the road network was already well established. And one of the reasons that the railway system came to an end was bus. Bus would leave you at the door. It was closer to you. With the railways, you had a lot of walking to do to get to the railway station. And that really was the end of the railway network, certainly in the west of Donegal, and it shrunk then over time. And sure, look at, we are where we are today. One thing I'd never understand was how the rail line itself was never kept intact. People have built houses on it. People have fenced it off. I think there was I don't know, that's maybe typical Ireland. When we had the network, we should have just protected it and looked after it. But anyway, that's what happened. But there's a few different things of stories and folklore. And the first one maybe I'll tell you is the confessions. People actually used the railways to get confessions. They didn't like going to the local priest when they had a sin to tell. So what they would do is jump on the train and go to the neighbouring parish and then go to the priest there and tell their sins. You know, that this was one of the great benefits of the railway. You know, it reminds me of. I will tell a wee joke because it's the day it is. It reminds me of the new curate arrives. Did you hear this? New curate arrives to the parish, and he's only there a few days, and his bicycle goes missing, and he doesn't know what to do. Someone has stolen his bicycle, you know, and so he goes into the parish priest and he says, you know, he says my bicycle is gone. He says, stolen. And the parish priest says, God, no. He says, we're wild good people in this parish. That would never happen. He says, that would never, ever happen in our parish. And he says, well, it's gone. He says, it's somebody has to have stolen it. He says, it's not there anymore. Well, he says, you know what I'll do? He says, I'll let you say the 11 o'clock mass on Sunday morning, he says, and he says, you work through the 10 commandments. And when you go to thou shalt not steal, he says, you look down, take your time, and he says, and I tell you, you'll spot the fella that stole your bike. Because they'll not be able to look. He says, I know my people, he says, and the head will go down, he says, you know. So that was all right. He went in and he did what the parish priest said to him, and that was grand. Sunday came and Sunday went, and a few days later the parish priest was out walking, and he said, hey, come here. He says, you never told me how you get on. He says, did you ever figure out what I told you to do? He says, I did exactly what you told me to do. He says, what did you do? He says, well, he says, I started off the 10 commandments, he says. And he says, and what, you got as far as thou shalt not steal? He says, no, he says, I got as far as thou shalt not commit adultery, and then I remembered where I left my bicycle. So back to the railway and the confessions. That's terrible. Apologies to all the priests, but confessions. People would do.
Nothing's changed.
Nothing's changed. Patrick Pearse also would have come to Donegal and came to Creesla. There's a fabulous story told about him arriving to Creesla, and there was a delegation to meet him, and they were to go to a Law's house. He was the MP down in Marble Hill, and the house is still there. And actually, he learned to do the fairy dance there. There was a crowd waiting for him, and Dermot McIntyre's father, he was a musician, he was playing the fiddle. But what happened was a delegation, or some of the people knew that there was to be a party on in Law's house, and they arrived earlier. And so when Pearse arrives to the house from the train in Creesla to go down to Marble Hill, the people that have arrived from Godahork have eaten all the food. And there was no food for them. They kind of played an offside trick in that. But he would have used the railway to come down to Donegal. Roger Casement would have come on it, and there's various entries in the diaries about him and what he was doing and how he was so good, fixing a girl's shoe in Cloughaneely at the train station. He had a hammer in the bag, and her shoe was broke, needing mending. Charlie McGee, I think he's the second man shot in 1916. He was originally from Inishboffinia and Castle Bellingham. I've written a wee bit about him, but he came home and he's buried in Godahork, and so his body was taken home on the train. So just even to think of that alone. And again, during the War of Independence, lots and lots of stories, but this is Canon Tommy Doherty, who I knew fairly well. And when I was teaching St. Eunan's, I used to go in and see him in the evening times, himself and Rose, because when he retired, he moved from Dunfanny to Letterkenny, and his house wasn't too far from where I was taking digs, and I'd always go up and see them. and he told me loads and loads of stories. I actually recorded them, and I really enjoyed them. And he told me that there's lots of stories, but he told me that the first night he spent in Dunfanny, he spent in jail. So when he was appointed parish priest in Dunfanny, he told them, by the way, when I was here, the first time I ever was here, I was sent in jail. And the story goes, which is true, his father was in the old IRA, and the British Army were trying to get into the west of Ireland. You're talking about 1919, 1921. And they were coming from Derry, get off at Letterkenny, and then they were to go from Letterkenny into the west of Donegal, into Dunlow. And there was quite a contingent of them. And his father didn't want the contingent in, because it would put the IRA under pressure in the west of Donegal during the War of Independence. So he went to the train driver and said, look, don't drive the train. And the train said, oh, I'm driving the train. So then they went to the stoker, and the stoker is the man that would keep the fire going. And he says, well, I'll not stoke, because it was obviously an important job to keep the pressure right. But he says, I need to get home. And Canon Doherty's father said, no problems, to get you home. So they commandeered a car, and it was Tommy Doherty, who was a student in Maynooth at the time, who drove this man home to Burtonport. But on his way back, after dropping the stoker off in Burtonport, on his way back home through Dunfanny, the RIC were waiting for him and arrested him and put him into the cell for the night, because they knew what his errand was about, you know. And I remember him telling me that there. Also, there was like times that letters and information were being sent on these rail, you know, people were sending letters, and particularly in my own hometown, and Ethna Coyle and others would hold up the train with a gun, and they were just looking for the mail bags. And then they would pull them onto the bridge, particularly in Mean Derry, it's still there, and they'd open them up to see what information was being sent out. And they did come across some people giving information to the establishment as to who and what was happening in the community. So they were things that were done. One of the sadder stories, and this is a story that actually the woman recently, she's not that long dead, that her husband would have told this story, but men were out working in the fields in Cloughaneely, I'll not say where, and the train track ran along there, and whatever work they were at, but at one point they heard this baby crying, and it was a baby in a hedge wrapped up. And obviously the mother, the train wouldn't have been going too fast, the mother, whoever the mother was, left the baby on the hedge and jumped back on the train and headed back to wherever she was from. And that baby was taken into care. Now you're going back now to the 1920s, 1930s. So it must have been a terrible, hard journey for that mother to do, and, you know, to the pain and all that was in it. But there were stories like that as well. So you have lots of things connected to the train. It was like a clock for many people as well, because when they would hear the train coming, they would know it was the what time it was. So the railway workers were really astonished when Victoria, they were given a day off in full pay in tribute to Queen Victoria in 1901. That was just an interesting one that I observed. So I'll end with this one by Dominic Kelly. I don't know if you know of Dominic Kelly. He had lovely poetry, and my dad, God rest him, this is him reading the poem, and we'll play it and we'll end with that. And if you have any questions.
Here I labour in the lagging on this frosty winter's day, from my friends and fond relations many, many miles away. I'm cold and very hungry, and inside me is a pain when I see her steaming by there. Ah, the old home train. Now I dream of Glenty Station and the road along Lough Finn, where the scrag hills overhanging echoes back the railway din. When I'm tired snidding turnips, on this flat and flooded plain, man, I'm glad to see her coming. Ah, the old home train. Hauling turf from Minahalla, bags of wool from Ballinamore, butter from the Highland valleys round Cloughan and Glanmore. With her red and yellow carriage, sadly soiled with sooty stain, there's no finer sight in Aon than the old home train. Every evening I do see her puffing bravely down the line, and my soul is filled with longing for the heather and the brine. There's a colleen in her cottage, saw ye her from the window pane, as ye passed her house this morning. Ah, me old home train. But I'm bound by regulations, and I cannot go away from this farmer in the lagging till the coming 12th of May. Then I'll pack my wee belongings and I'll soon be home again, stepping gladly at the station of the old home train.
So there you go. I just got to Michael, thank you for your attention and for your listening and all the rest.
Well, I just want to say a massive thanks to Joe for that talk there. It's fantastic to hear and to put the Donegal Railways into that context of what you might call kind of big history. Some of the topics coming up there, the kind of long shadow of the famine that kind of underlies the history of the railways. You've got that laissez-faire economics movement and the shift, the correction, let's say, to interventionism later in the 19th century, and a great sense of the significance of Donegal's railway system nationally. We've got visits from Balfour, Pearse and Casement all coming up, and of course I also think that the whole history around the War of Independence and the railways is a fantastic or fascinating one as well. At one point, I'm not 100% sure of. I think the Phoenix Park I thought that was named after the Donegal Shunter, the Phoenix, but that's one for the railheads there.
Interestingly, the Ars and Uachtaran belonged to one of the Leitrim's, Lord Leitrim's connection. He was the groundskeeper or the gamekeeper in Phoenix Park, and he built the original building, which he then later subsequently sold to the British government, which they then developed into what now is Ars and Uachtaran.
All right.
So that's a Donegal connection as well.
This is fantastic.
Sorry.
No, it is an amazing thing to discuss those connections and sort of unpick them in that way. I think, Joe, if you're free, we could take a few questions if that's all right, and I'll pass over to Mark to lead that because he's got a few.
But
coming
if
through
you've lost
on
your
the stream
bicycle,
too.
I don't know where it is. Don't ask me.
So I'll take. Is there any questions from the floor?
Yeah, I'm surprised you never mentioned the Stevante to Letterkenny railway line.
Yeah, I did mention it there. That was the Letterkenny extension to Strabane. That's where it was going. That was where all the difficulties were. Do you remember I put up all the different acts in the 1860s? There was various, and it was stopping and starting and stopping and starting, and eventually then they went for the small gauge to keep the reduction down. And Fireland that had been given the contract. So that was, maybe I didn't make it clear, but that was the Letterkenny.
The reason I'm raising it, Convy Woolen Mills would have had a say in that railway coming from Strabane on until Letterkenny, because that's the way they exported their yarn and brought in the wool. But also that railway, it was only about, say, 10 mile. It was earmarked in 1916 or 1917 to be lifted and brought to the front line during the First War, because they needed short, narrow gauge lines to transport the troops and the ammunition to the front line. And whatever battle it was changed the war and it didn't lift. But I mind that railway line in existence because I got on a train with my mother at Convy railway station, went to Strabane, got the train from Strabane to Derry, changed at Portadown for Dublin, crossed over and got the train to Wexford. My mother was a Wexford woman, and that's the way we come back. Took us a whole bloody day, but I went from Convy to Wexford by train.
Wow, well done.
I also remember the time that lines were being lifted. The train come up from Strabane with the long carriage or trailers, lift the rails, and the sleepers were left there for the farmers to take the sleepers. The trains then ended up in Letterkenny, and then it had to be transported by road back to Strabane, and that train, I don't know if it was this one here, lay in Strabane for years. Lay there in years at the Camel's Hump.
Yeah.
It's a Drumbo, yeah. Lay there for years. And I mind that very well.
Letterkenny line was scrapped Letterkenny.
Yeah, but you're on about why it wasn't preserved, why the lines when they closed they weren't preserved. The obvious reason was because the railway lines went through farmers' land, and the tracks went back to the farmer because they went through the farmer's ground. He claimed them, and that was a problem why they couldn't shut them down and preserve them. Which we all know now that they should have done that, but that's the reason it wasn't preserved. But I do remember, getting the train. I was only about 1956, I think it was 57 maybe, the whole way from Convy to Wexford and back. Not in the same train, obviously, by rail.
It's amazing history.
Yeah.
Amazing history.
Anybody else?
But it's rumoured too that they got the farmer to buy the land back that the rails ran on. And if he didn't have the money or claimed not to have the money, they lent him the money. And then they never came back looking for the money that they lent. So they were determined, hell or high water, they were getting rid of the infrastructure. So that's when the real damage was done. So it wasn't the rolling stock, it was in poor condition. But it could have been replaced when times got a bit better if they'd left the tracks in place.
Now they're talking about putting a cycleway through the gap on the old railway line.
Crying shame. Remember going through the same gap? And it was like the road was straightened through the gap in later years to facilitate that to straighten the river. I remember going through on the train to Strabane because I'd not lived in Strabane, and you were up on the side of the mountain, and when you looked down, the lorries and the few cars they were like dinky toys down below you. It was fascinating. On its own, it was a tourist attraction.
Yeah.
You know, some of the scenic routes that were in the county at the time.
You mentioned about Donegal. We all seen the map. We're all aware that Donegal is, it is forgotten. But within that county, East Donegal is definitely forgotten.
So how long did they say it took to build the line between Letterkenny and Burtonport?
I actually, off the top of my head, I don't remember.
I think it's 3 years.
Yeah, it didn't take them terribly
I think
long.
it's not much more than 3 years, and we have a famous 4 lines going into Letterkenny,
Aye,
and with all the modern machinery of the day, and it took them the best part of 3 years to do it.
that's right.
Well, that dual carriageway.
4 lanes. The famous.
And can you compare that to the fact of no machinery or no...
All the houses were railed, for all infrastructure was done that time. Crazy.
Amazing. Yeah, that's an interesting analogy.
Yeah.
I must actually calculate that out now. Well spotted.
Anybody else?
A modern question. What's the chances of Letterkenny to Derry? Or Derry to Letterkenny?
Of a railway?
Yes, because
Well-
they are major population centres and the modern railways for passengers.
Look, realistically none. We can't even get a road network from Lifford to Letterkenny, never mind a railway. And you've seen what happened with the A5 connection. It's just, it makes sense, but I don't think it'll ever, I don't see it happening in my lifetime anyway. It's not on the agenda, it would appear. I don't want to get political about it, but so we saw that recently with the hospital, and you know, we eventually got the surgical unit that we were entitled to, but we were made feel that this was a great gift to us, that this was something we were entitled to, and it's the same, like we really have to beg for any kind of infrastructure.
But you did mention the politics of it, and that's one of the reasons we have. We return 5 TDs at every general election. And you mentioned one there that I know him very well, Paddy Kelly.
Yeah.
When they all went to Dublin, they couldn't even fight for Donegal as a collective team. They all had their own wee parochial issues, and that's why we are forgotten. Because if you take any of the rest of the part, I'm getting politics here, you take any other part of the country, you get TDs from different shades of political persuasions. When they get to Dalhir, they fight for their own local area. Up here it seems to be different.
Really Healy Ray up here.
Yeah, you're right. Yeah.
I was going to say the former Great Northern Line from Strabane to Derry is basically the track base intact from Lifford to Derry, and that was double track, and that's because the line shut in '65 and most of the land went to the local councils. So the track base is perfectly clear from Lifford through Carrigas and St Johnson into Derry to this day. That was the Great Northern Line, opened in 1847.
Wow. Anybody else?
Just in terms of employment, you know, what was the pay of maybe the gatekeeper, the driver, the workers? Obviously it did provide employment, but what about approximately what would their pay have been?
Actually, I can't answer that. I don't know the answer, but I'll tell you where you can find the answer. Sweeney has written a book, Frank Sweeney. Yeah, it's a fabulous book, The Owl Centre, and in that there's all that information you would have in it. So off the top of my head, I don't have your answer, but it's still available, that book. I think Frank is no longer with us, but he had all that information.
Would it be available in the library?
It should be.
It should be in the library.
We actually have a letter from around.
They had to work or nothing came into the house. That's a fact.
The gamekeeper, or not the gamekeeper, the gatekeeper.
What year?
Was kind of tied to the railway, but they had a reduced rate.
Yeah.
Living on it. The gatekeeper's house in Convey there is still in existence. And it's still occupied. It's been occupied since since it was built. And I think the lady that's in it at the moment, her father-in-law was the last person that opened the gate in Convey, opened and closed the gate. I mind it very well across the road there. But that house is still occupied, like a few other houses throughout the county. These gate houses are still in existence. But they lived in it on, how would you put it? It was part and parcel of their work to open the gates and close the gate. Of course they got a reduced salary, but they're mostly rent-free.
Oh, yeah.
You talk about the child being found in the hedge. It must have been a favourite place for leaving children that weren't that welcome into the world. There was one found at the stop at Barney's Gap as you go in. She was known locally. Somebody took her in and reared her. And she emigrated when she got old enough. And what was her name? Mary Barnes. That was as close to it. And I remember saying to my mother, did anybody know who she was? Oh, troth and soul. There was plenty knew who she was. But it never was said. Yeah. Sad, you know. But at least she was left. She wasn't. I would think happened to a lot of the Kerry babies jumping to mind.
Joe, just in relation to the closure of the lines both north and south, they sort of closed roughly around the same time, didn't they? You know, and in terms of both governments, I think there was sort of a policy there, not official, but unofficial. And of course here in the Republic we had the famous civil servant, Ryan Tubridy's grandfather, who was the senior civil servant in the Department of Transport, who basically closed most of the rail lines, the small narrow gauge rail lines, not just in Donegal, by the way, because if you look at your map and you look down the southwest of the country, around Killarney and out to the Dingle Peninsula and all around there, they also were closed around that time. So it wasn't just Donegal, right? And I know, and I often hear you on the radio talking about, you know, Donegal not getting its fair share. All I can say to you about that is, and I don't mind you saying it now and again, but Donegal, more than any other county in the west or the northwest of Ireland, has had more government ministers and ministers of state. We've had 4 ministers here, senior ministers, in the last 20-25 years. No other county in the west or the northwest has had 4. Okay? So if we are behind, it is our own TDs and ministers who are not pushing it. So therefore, it's in the hands of the people of Donegal to change. But they don't.
They should do what they do in other counties, work together when they go to Dublin.
But anyway, you might just comment on the closure. Sorry, Joe, you might just comment on the closure though.
I will look
both
at the
north and south.
closure, as I mentioned, from what I understand from the reading I've done, is basically these stations were too hard to get to, particularly in northwest Donegal, but they were very rural and they were not necessarily beside the population areas. They were built where geographically it was easier for them to construct the train. So I'm just thinking of my own hometown. They were there's nobody living there, so it was for you to get there took quite a distance of walking.
There was also a military issue behind it too with these railways, because they could transport the troops anywhere in the county. They didn't mean to say they had to go into the towns or anything like that, but they were going past barracks and stuff like that. So they had control of the whole population. And you're on about cutting back on the rails and all that. 56 or whatever it was. 60, that was Beecham. That boy you're referring to was related to Beecham.
That was in England, not here.
Yeah, well, it's the same cousin.
Here is a case where the railway here, there's a lack of investment, and the government in Stormont is totally anti-rail. They shut down all the lines cross-border in 1957. They're talking Ballyshannon on Tuesday night, and the whole line, every line was shut down cross-border in 1957, except the Derry line and the Dublin line. That was it. And here, because Hamilton was owned by CE, their house was owned by the British government, so Stormont was told to shut this place down in 1959.
Anybody
That's our
else?
hope maybe with United Ireland that they'll work together on this
again.
again.
We're getting, boys and ladies, up here, it's different.
Dermot Walsh, God have mercy on him, coined that one.
Just a bit there, you were asking about wages. We actually have in the museum a letter written by one of the steam engine drivers back in 1880, I think, asking for a pay rise. So we'll try and take that out and you can have a look at it. Right, any more questions from anyone?
That's us now.
All right, thanks very much. And I'll say thanks to anybody who's watching online. I'm going to end the stream now online. So thanks for tuning in and thank you, Joe.
It's a tight